From Feature Story News in New York, I'm Sarah Walton. The Senate trial of Donald Trump moved closer on Thursday as the upper chamber took control of 2 articles of impeachment against the US president. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, will also be sworn in Thursday before presiding over the trial, due to begin early next week. From Washington, here's FSN's Kevin McAleese.
The first task for Justice Roberts will be to swear in the 100 senators who will effectively act as the jury for this trial, only the third time in history the impeachment process has reached the upper chamber. While Speaker Nancy Pelosi has already announced her 7 impeachment prosecutors who will argue the case against Trump, the White House has yet to confirm the president's defense lineup. Republicans, who hold the majority in the Senate, still need to decide the rules that will govern the trial. The articles accuse Trump of abuse of power and obstructing Congress. He denies any wrongdoing. Kevin McAleese, Washington.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian authorities have begun a criminal investigation into whether President Trump's supporters were spying on the former US ambassador Marie Yovanovitch before she was dismissed from her post by the Trump administration. The former envoy's movements were being monitored according to letters, phone records and flash drives obtained from Lev Parnas, an aide to Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Here's more from FSN's Kate Fisher.
The evidence from Lev Parnas adds new detail about claims that President Trump pressured Ukraine into investigating his political rival, Joe Biden. These claims, which the president denies, are the subject of his impeachment trial. Some of the materials, which House Democrats are presenting as evidence in the inquiry, show Mr. Parnas and Mr. Giuliani discussing the removal of Ms. Yovanovitch, who was fired last May for reasons that remain unclear. The news comes as US government watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, ruled that the White House broke the law by withholding aid to Ukraine that had been approved by Congress. Kate Fisher, Washington.
Aid agencies have raised the alarm over unprecedented levels of hunger in southern Africa, with a record number of people facing food shortages. The United Nations has warned the region is facing a climate emergency as drought and widespread flooding wreaks havoc on the region. FSN's US correspondent Danielle Robertson reports.
A record 45 million people across southern Africa are facing hunger, with women and children bearing the brunt of the crisis. The 16 nations in the Southern African Development Community is a region identified as a climate hotspot. Central and western areas have been hit by the worst drought in 35 years, as places like Mozambique and Zimbabwe are still recovering from the effects of Cyclone Idai that hit in March last year. Zimbabwe is also experiencing its worst economic crisis in a decade. Danielle Robertson, Los Angeles.
From Bureaus Worldwide, this is FSN.
This is a test of the emergency podcast system. Activated by contract termination. Rumors of our demise are greatly exaggerated. Welcome to Stacy on the Right with your host, Stacy Washington. She's blessed to be a Bible-reading, gun-toting, Air Force veteran, wife and mom, righteously American.
Welcome to the program today. It's so good to be with you again after what has basically been a week and a half. And then before that, another almost 2 weeks of filling in at different localities. So just to update, I got a chance to fulfill my little contract a little bit over at Sirius. And I filled in for Andrew Wilkow over Christmas. It was actually Christmas week. So the day before Christmas and then the days after Christmas. So 3 days total. And then I did WMAL. I was on for Larry O'Connor while he was out a little bit right before Christmas. And then after that, I got a chance to come back in for Larry because he was actually on his true vacation, went on a big cruise with his family. And I filled in for him for 8 days, which was the first 3 days of this week, all 5 of the days last week. And on Tuesday of last week, I actually filled in for David Webb in the morning and then Larry O'Connor in the afternoon. So it was Sirius and WMAL. WMAL is a heritage station out of Washington, D.C., which is a number 7 media market. And the fantastic thing about that, besides the exposure and the fantastic audience, is it's a Cumulus station. And I've had a relationship with them for years, since the first time I ever filled in for Larry, which I'm not sure if that was 2012 or 2011. It was a long time ago. And that was when he was on in the morning. And so I was filling in for him then. And so it's just, it's one of those things, honestly. It was fun. It was fun to do. But it also meant 3 hours of radio a day. So it was a real, ramp up for me. And I just want to say thank you, God. Thank you. I give glory to God for the actual opportunity and for how much fun it was. And thanks to all of you for the kind words. When I did try to stream to here, and I did a few of the days. And so it was like marrying up two systems, streaming from here while I'm doing the show there and all that. But I think it worked out okay. And now I'm back. And so what's on the show for today? Well, we are going to talk about the celebration of impeachment that the Democrats put on yesterday, which was so glaringly political that actually they had people on CNN ripping them for it. And then we're going to delve into Misinformation Nation. And that's going to be the show for today. Is we're going to unpack this study about misinformation being something that plagues both sides of the political aisle, and how we can combat that. This is important for us. Knowing the truth is what helps us. It enables us to be able to really make good decisions. So if you're making decisions from a baseline of wrong information, then obviously your decisions will be flawed as well. So first, let's talk about this. Yesterday, they had the, what was it called? Engrossment. They had the engrossment ceremony, which is when you basically sign the articles of impeachment. The president is then impeached. Up until that moment, he hadn't been impeached yet. And then the articles are transmitted, which was a ceremonial procession. The Democrats, it was like they were carrying the last Ark of the Covenant, or the lost Ark of the Covenant, or maybe like they were like the flower girl walking on the rose petals with those things. It was so ludicrous. So Nancy Pelosi signed the articles of impeachment. She had a pen. She had a group of ceremonial pens, and they had her name engraved on them. They were black with gold accents or brass accents, and she signed each letter of her name with a pen and then handed them out with a smile, kind of the way the president signs landmark legislation that has been brought to Washington, D.C. by groups of real Americans who like a law that protects children from sex trafficking, or a law that gives a benefit to people, like the right to try legislation. Whenever he does that, and all presidents do this, they sign a little bit of their name with each pen so that they can give the pens to the people who spent the sometimes years bringing the legislation to Congress. Sometimes they work it through their state legislature, then take it to Congress. Then Congress finally picks it up, passes it, and these people have accomplished something. And so they go to these ceremonies. They're invited to the Oval Office. They get to see the president sign this legislation into law, and then they get a pen to commemorate their hard work. And it really is, it's something that's so special, because you would think to yourself, this is what I have thought previously, it's just a pen. But if you spend years of your life shepherding a piece of legislation from an idea to actual law, and you watch the president sign it and make it finished to complete your work, you are going to be happy about that. So, that was absolutely what we saw happen there. So let's listen to the audio of the CNN hosts. They were perplexed. They were on a panel, and they're just sitting there talking about this, and they're trying to unpack the big picture of this whole thing. Like, why did she say that this was a sad and somber day, yet she was smiling and kind of coquettish, and then she uses the ceremonial pins and then hands them out with glee? What is going on here? Let's take a listen.
That's right. And it's a ceremonial. The one thing I will say, and as we were watching it, we are used to seeing signing ceremonies, handing out pens at moments of celebration. when a president is signing legislation, when even sometimes, in a rare occasion, but it has happened, when the House sends over a landmark piece of legislation. It was unusual to see that kind of ceremony and making, handing out the pens and smiling for a picture in this kind of situation where the House Speaker has bent over backwards to say publicly and privately, this is somber, this is not a time for a celebration. Understandable, this is history, and the people who are involved want to mark the moment, but I didn't expect to see that.
Yeah.
So right now, we're going to head into a quick information break here, and I'm going to be right back with you.
From Feature Story News in New York, I'm Sarah Walton. The Senate trial of Donald Trump moved closer on Thursday as the upper chamber took control of 2 articles of impeachment against the US president. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, will also be sworn in Thursday before presiding over the trial due to begin early next week. From Washington, here's FSN's Kevin McAleese.
The first task for Justice Roberts will be to swear in the 100 senators who will effectively act as the jury for this trial. Only the third time in history the impeachment process has reached the upper chamber. While Speaker Nancy Pelosi has already announced her 7 impeachment prosecutors who will argue the case against Trump, the White House has yet to confirm the president's defense lineup. Republicans, who hold the majority in the Senate, still need to decide the rules that will govern the trial. The articles accuse Trump of abuse of power and obstructing Congress. He denies any wrongdoing. Kevin McAleese, Washington.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian authorities have begun a criminal investigation into whether President Trump's supporters were spying on the former US ambassador Marie Yovanovitch before she was dismissed from her post by the Trump administration. The former envoy's movements were being monitored according to letters, phone records and flash drives obtained from Lev Parnas, an aide to Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Here's more from FSN's Kate Fisher.
The evidence from Lev Parnas adds new detail about claims that President Trump pressured Ukraine into investigating his political rival, Joe Biden. These claims, which the president denies, are the subject of his impeachment trial. Some of the materials, which House Democrats are presenting as evidence in the inquiry, show Mr. Parnas and Mr. Giuliani discussing the removal of Ms. Yovanovitch, who was fired last May for reasons that remain unclear. The news comes as US government watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, ruled that the White House broke the law by withholding aid to Ukraine that had been approved by Congress. Kate Fisher, Washington.
Aid agencies have raised the alarm over unprecedented levels of hunger in southern Africa, with a record number of people facing food shortages. The United Nations has warned the region is facing a climate emergency as drought and widespread flooding wreaks havoc on the region. FSN's US correspondent Danielle Robertson reports.
A record 45 million people across southern Africa are facing hunger, with women and children bearing the brunt of the crisis. The 16 nations in the Southern African Development Community is a region identified as a climate hotspot. Central and western areas have been hit by the worst drought in 35 years, as places like Mozambique and Zimbabwe are still recovering from the effects of Cyclone Idai that hit in March last year. Zimbabwe is also experiencing its worst economic crisis in a decade. Danielle Robertson, Los Angeles.
From Bureaus Worldwide, this is FSN.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right.
All right, welcome back to the program. So, what we had was this discussion on CNN. And the issue that they had was that the ceremonial pins are usually reserved for events that are absolutely celebrations. And for her to do that meant that she was implying that it was a celebration. Whether she wants to admit that or not, the optics of it were that it was a celebration. So I think it was another backfire for her. I think a lot of people will just dismiss it. Low information people are only looking for opportunities for Nancy Pelosi to own the president. But for Americans who pay attention, she made a misstep. It didn't look good. It wasn't the proper way for her to handle the situation. And in the moment, while she got obviously those who are with her gave her accolades for what she did. It was like, I get to keep this pen for the rest of my life because I helped impeach President Trump. But for Americans, the politicization of impeachment is something that's serious and it's not just sobering. It makes you almost anticipate more actions like this. It portends poorly for the future. So this isn't going to be something that Americans want to see happen over and over again. And that means you have to kind of think about whether or not you want the Democrats in charge. Do you want them to control the House so they can continue this kind of punitive action against the president? I don't know. I know I don't. I don't want any more of these antics. But in order for the Republicans to earn the trust of the American people, they have to do something when they control the House. Like, I don't know, pass a budget. They have to, instead of governing from a place of fear and inactivity and from a stance of being paralyzed, they've got to step forward boldly and courageously. If they're given the House back, they have to actually act like they want to keep it. They have to actually get stuff done at the risk of their political careers, at the risk of angering people. The inaction makes it possible for Democrats to say they're not doing anything, they're not for you, and then the Democrats are swept back in, and then the Republicans are powerless, and then they start saying, well, if we only had the House, we can't really do anything if we only had the House. Well, you had it, and you did nothing with it. That's why it's so hard for anybody to say we need to give the House back to the Republicans. So now let's move over to this next. This is something that I want to fully unpack here because it's so important for us to be informed, well informed. So this comes over from justfacts.com, and it's a scientific survey that shows voters are widely accepting misinformation spread by the media, and it's on both sides of the political aisle. Now, we often will see politicos, talking heads, media types railing against misinformation. Usually, they're left-leaning media types, and when they rail against misinformation, they're doing it from a position of, you should believe me, you shouldn't believe the Republicans. You should believe me, you are misinformed if you support the president. So obviously, most Americans are going to go against that. Why should we accept anything from Chuck Todd or anyone else when we know that they're leftists and they're against us? Not just against, like, the political ideology. They are against Americans who do not ascribe to Democratic Party platform ideals. Pure and simple. So the findings actually come from a survey. The survey was commissioned by JustFacts. JustFacts.com is a nonprofit research and educational institute. The survey was actually conducted by Triton Polling and Research, and Triton Polling and Research uses sound methodologies to go out and make phone calls and speak to U.S. residents, and they seek out U.S. residents who regularly vote, so active voters. They're an academic research firm, and they don't just measure public opinion like most polls. They use a unique methodology to assess voters' knowledge of all of the different things that are facing Americans. So it's done every year. And the poll covers such topics as education, healthcare, pollution, national debt, taxes, government spending, global warming, Social Security, hunger, energy, and poverty. Every year, the poll adds a new question, and they pull that new question from a top-line issue that is in the news and making waves with American voters. Usually, they choose an issue that's controversial. The controversial issue this year was poverty. So there's a methodology to it. For each of the questions that they ask the participants, you're offered a selection of at least 3 answers to choose from. One of the answers is true, the rest are false. There's an additional line where you can simply select, I'm unsure. So you don't know what the answer is. You say, I don't know, and that is recorded as well. So voters, on average, gave the correct answer 39% of the time and gave an incorrect answer 54% of the time and marked unsure 6% of the time. Overall, a majority of voters gave an correct answer to only 5 of the 24 questions. So when you look at which questions elicited the most inaccurate answers, those questions related to child hunger, tax burdens, landfills, poverty, health insurance co-payments, and elements of Social Security. For these 7 questions, 3/4 or more of the voters provided an incorrect answer. And notice I have not yet actually gone into the partisanship divide. We're just talking overall. So 8 of the 10 questions that were the ones with the most misinformation, the most incorrectly answered 8 of the 10 questions, there were links to progressive storylines that appear in the media. And those answers were often way out in la la land. It was like unicorn popcorn. They weren't just slightly mistaken on these answers. They were literally far out in left field because that's what the media, that's what the media puts out. So the first example we can look at is that 79% of voters think that middle-class people pay far more of their income in federal taxes than the top 1% of income earners. The Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. Treasury, and Tax Policy Center all document that households in the top 1% pay an average federal tax rate that is about 2.5 times higher than middle-class earners. The latest CBO data on federal taxes shows on average in 2016, middle-income households paid $10,100 in taxes on income of $75,900, which is an effective tax rate of 13%. And the top 1% of those same households paid $595,900 in taxes on income of $1,789,800, which is an effective tax rate of 33%. Media outlets, nonetheless, constantly report that middle-income households pay more in tax than high-income households. This is just what they say. They don't care to research it. When someone comes on who's a guest and says, that's not true, the CBO data doesn't show that, they dismiss that person as being a bigot or a racist or some such other. So there were also results by age, gender, and politics, and those results show deep partisan and demographic divides, different groups being on one side or the other. So you have, in total, rates at which voters gave the correct answer varied from a top line of 46% for Trump voters to a low of 32% for Democratic voters, and then everyone else fell in between. So correct answers, 46% of Trump voters gave correct answers. Men, 43% of them gave correct answers. 35 to 64-year-olds, 41% of them gave correct answers. 38% of 65 and over gave correct answers, and 37% for 18 to 34-year-olds. 36% of females gave correct answers. 32% of Democratic voters gave correct answers. Now, unsure and third-party voters were represented in too small of numbers for them to produce meaningful data based on their responses. Now, I want to run through the questions with you, and it's important for us to know exactly what it is that we're misinformed about. And since there is a significant portion of voters on the right who are misinformed as well, this means it's an educational process for everyone. And instead of kind of pointing the fingers and saying, well, they're the most misinformed, which the Democrats are, it's important for us to just address the beam in our own eye, right? Get informed ourselves. So question number 1 was, quote, relative to other nations, how do you believe U.S. fourth graders rank in terms of their reading and math ability? Are they in the bottom 50% or in the top 50%? The correct answer is that U.S. fourth graders are in the top 50% per international tests that are administered to students in dozens of nations. Per the international tests that are administered to students in dozens of nations. U.S. fourth graders rank in the top 30% of nations for reading and math. So the relative performance of U.S. students has declined over time and continues to do so. And by the age of 15, U.S. students rank in the bottom 50% in reading and the bottom 20% in math. So the problems of the U.S. education system appear to be in the later years and not the early years. So the stress that most pundits place on getting better early childhood education programs seems to be energy in the wrong area. Instead of saying every kid needs to be in preschool, which is, if you say every, and then the word child comes at the end of that sentence, you're going to run into problems because children are unique individuals and some of them will need something a little different. So on this particular subject, what it appears is that because leftist policy and their cohorts in the media sincerely desire to see publicly funded preschools, they stress the need for early childhood education, but statistical data shows that what we really need in U.S. public schools is more resources and attention paid to the middle and high school years because children do pretty well in grammar school. The achievement gaps tend to trend outward and the gaps get larger the further along in school children progress. So, who gave the correct answers to this question? Well, 40% of all voters got it right. 46% of all Democrat voters got it right. 48% of Trump voters got it right. 46% of men, 48% of women, 53% of 18 to 34-year-olds, 49% of 35 to 64-year-olds, and 42% of 65-year-olds. So there's a significant amount of misinformation there in every demographic. The second question is, on average across the United States, how much do you think public schools spend per year to educate each classroom of students? Less or more than $150,000 per classroom per year. Now, this is a metric that I don't often see. Usually, the amount of money that's spent on education in a district is calculated by per pupil expenditure, not classroom. So it's an interesting question. The correct answer is, on average across the United States, we spend more than $150,000 per year on each classroom of students. The average cost to educate a classroom of kids in public school is about $332,000 per year. So the media constantly puts out that we don't spend enough money on education in America, that education is underfunded. But Department of Education data shows that the average inflation-adjusted spending per public school student has actually risen. It's tripled since 1960. So the correct answer to this question was given by 36% of all voters, 26% of Democrats, 45% of Trump voters, 46% of men, 28% of women, 25% of 18 to 34-year-olds, 40% of 35 to 64-year-olds, and 33% of 65-year-olds. So one thing we can say before continuing on to the next question is that the media is very good at spreading misinformation, all the while decrying the spread of misinformation. Question 3. In your mind, what portion of 17 to 24-year-olds in the U.S. are unqualified for military service because of poor physical fitness, weak educational skills, medical conditions, illegal drug use, or criminal records? The correct answer is more than half. According to different reporting agencies within our government and the Department of Defense, 2/3 to 3/4 of all 17 to 24-year-olds are unqualified for military service because of weak educational skills, illegal drug use, medical conditions, criminal records, or poor physical fitness. The correct answer was given by 43% of all voters, 37% of Democrat voters, 51% of Trump voters, 44% of the men, 42% of the women, 40% of 18 to 34-year-olds, and 46% of 35 to 64-year-olds, and 41% of 65 and over. So there are more questions like this in this survey. Suffice it to say, on all of them, when I went through and read this article, there were none of them where you have a majority of the people who are correct when they give the answer. I mean, it's stunning that so many people are misinformed on these items. Well, actually, there were a couple of questions. Taxes and spending were the subject areas where there were over 50% of Trump voters and men and 18 to 34-year-olds who had the answer right. But overall, it's an abysmal percentage of people who have the correct answers. So what's the key? Well, we have to maybe put our phones down, TVs off, spend more time reading. When we hear the media say that we spend too little on education, our first answer should be, oh, okay, wait, let me take a look at that. Let me see what the statistical information is on per pupil expenditure, per classroom expenditure per year, and let me see if they're right. Then once you get that answer, you tell, maybe the rule should be you have to tell 10 people you know. And then maybe you could convince 5 of those people that you tell to send a letter over to the news organization and say, here are some links. You provided incorrect information on your news program the other night. Please correct it. Will they do it? Maybe not the first time. But if people are writing in often enough, they would have to be held accountable. The other thing is maybe their advertisers need to know that they're spreading misinformation on the air. Essentially, if we're not willing to do that, we place ourselves in a position where we're going to continue to get misinformation, and other people who aren't taking the time to look it up will be the victims of actually running around saying they know stuff when really what they know is incorrect. And it's bad for us. It's bad for our voting patterns, and it's bad for America. So that's the show for today. It was a little information heavy, but we're back in the saddle. So thank you so much for being here. We'll be with you a little earlier tomorrow because I have a speaking engagement here locally in town. I'm giving a speech on minority get out the vote efforts. And God bless. Have a fantastic